Welcome everyone to the 5th Annual Interdisciplinary Research Conference. Today, kicking off our presentation, we will have Dr. Paul Copan speaking on the topic of ethical considerations regarding beginning of life issues. Dr. Paul Copan is the professor of philosophy ethics, the pledger of the School of Ministry, and he will begin now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it, Andrea.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. And I'll be speaking on a topic that is not merely beginning of life issues. It actually extends to a whole range of issues. And as you discuss the topic of abortion, you quickly find out that there are a lot of implications with regard to infanticide, with regard to euthanasia. And so it really is of a piece. It really is a continuous line from beginning to end of life. But we'll be focusing primarily on beginning of life issues. Now, perhaps this is, I'm hitting the button, but nothing is happening. Oh, there we go. All right. Hit the right button and we've got it. Okay, so when does life begin? Well, there are three different perspectives that are given here. The clergyman is saying at the moment of conception, and the Supreme Court justice is saying at birth, and then there's the dopey-looking teenager, right? When you get your driver's license, that's when life begins. So there you will have different perspectives, of course, in the Supreme Court. You will have renderings, on these sorts of issues. Well, that it's up to human beings to define what the meaning, their life's meaning is, and so on. But we still are dealing with a fundamental question of when does life begin? When do we begin talking about the sanctity of life? Some people will separate those, and again, for the sake of consistency, we'll see that they go together. Again, I'm going to be doing a brief overview of some issues and not a highly detailed talk here, but I wanted to begin by talking about Judith Jarvis Thomson, who raises an interesting philosophical question on the nature of abortion and what is morally permissible when it comes to abortion. And I think you want to jump in here?
Can I just double check? Please?
Double check my mic, okay. Are we working now?
Yes.
Okay. Do I need to rehash anything? Okay, all right. We'll unpack that in a moment, and then we'll look at how the Christian faith actually informs the whole abortion discussion, and then we'll round out with some final thoughts. But and again, I want to have this an interactive time, so we'll be engaging with you all on some of these issues as well. So here is the article that was made quite a splash, and a lot of ethics textbooks will use this as a case study, the pros and the cons and so forth. And this is a pretty sophisticated defense of abortion. So this is the scenario here. This is what Judith Jarvis Thomson asks us to consider. So I'll just read this, and again, want to interact with you on this. Is there something wrong with this picture? So Judith Jarvis Thomson says, you wake up in the morning and find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. He has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours, using very sophisticated medical language here, was plugged into yours, so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood, as well as your own. The director of the hospital now tells you, look, we're sorry the Society of Musical Lovers did this to you. We would never have permitted it if we had known. But still they did it, and the violinist is now plugged into you. To unplug you would be to kill him. But never mind, it's only for 9 months. By then he will have recovered from his ailment and can safely be unplugged from you. You see where this is going. Is it morally incumbent on you to accede to this situation? No doubt it would be very nice of you if you did, a great kindness. But do you have to accede to it? Well, what would you say? How would you respond to this sort of a moral issue, maybe a conundrum in your mind, something that may throw you for a little bit of a loop here? But what would you say in response to this? Is this a fair comparison to to a woman considering abortion? Is it a straightforward parallel? Are there differences? And of course, part of the point here is that if it is, even assuming that this person is has value and dignity and worth, would you still be, would you be under obligation to stay plugged into this violinist? And if you're not under obligation, then why would you be under obligation to, quote, stay plugged into maybe the child in your womb? So this is the kind of parallel that Judith Jarvis Thompson is trying to draw. And so anyway, that is a consideration for us here. Any preliminary thoughts here? I'm really counting on your discussion here. So any thoughts? Yes.
Sure. Doesn't that assume that the person has the ability to give consent to being plugged in, but with a baby with an embryo, they don't have that ability to say yes or no, like they don't have that ability to consent or not.
Okay, so let me try to put this. So here there is no consent involved with the violinist. That there is just done to someone without that person's permission. But when it comes to the unborn, the embryo, is there consent involved in that act? Yep. Typically, yeah. Got Tom jumping in here. You may have certain exceptions to that, but generally speaking, we see that as a consensual act rather than someone who is who's been plugged into you, and now you are without your consent, and now you have to consider sustaining that person in this particular circumstance. Other points to consider here. Any appropriate analogies to, lines of parallel lines to draw, or is it a strongly disanalogous? Yeah, Tom, jump in.
I think it's a pretty poor metaphor. I think part of it is if you are the individual and you have a love for the violinist's music, if you see value in that, then you would find it as a great honor and duty to be the person that sustains this individual and allows them to be reborn, if you will. But if you're a person who's very indifferent to the violinist or being a music lover, then you would not see the value and be probably more likely to unplug.
Okay, so is it a matter of saying, hey, classical music, this is really great stuff. I could be hooked up to this Yitzhak Perlman sort, and help perpetuate the love of music and perpetuate this man's career, say. But if you're maybe you're not too keen on rap music, and you're hooked up to Eminem or Puff Daddy or something like that, maybe you're not going to be as keen on this. Well, is it a matter of preference, or is it a matter of status here? We can ask that kind of a question. Is there an obligation regardless of the love that you have of music, of this particular type of music, or do you have an obligation nevertheless? A person is a person, no matter how small or how great or how significant or insignificant. So that's another question to be asking. Yes, Judy.
Well, so a difference that I see is like our bodies were created to sustain, like her body wasn't created to sustain another person's, like her kidneys weren't created to sustain both her body and another person's, but God created a woman to be able to sustain a child to be born. So like there's a difference in what our bodies are capable of in those two analogies.
Okay, so there's a certain design plan, perhaps, that we can talk about. That there is a certain goal, a certain telos, a certain end. And we see this in the entire process, from not just from the whole reproductive system, but you look at the gestation of the unborn child. You think of how women are equipped for nursing and so forth. I mean, there's a whole remarkable. It's like a prepackaged deal, if you will. That there is this, that women come equipped precisely for this kind of, an event of conception and gestation and birth and so forth. So there are some significant disanalogies here. So let's maybe unpack a little bit of this. But thank you for the contributions here. So, as we said before, the point that Thompson is making is that if one finds a human being parasitically attached without free consent, and quite possibly at great risk to the host's physical health, then that host has no moral obligation to continue to sustain this life, even if, for the sake of argument, that person is fully human. So there is no, if there is no moral obligation to sustain this life, even if the person is human at this level, then it would certainly apply to that of the unborn. So this is what Thompson is driving at. So, is this a valid comparison? So let's offer a few thoughts in response to Thompson. As we have just mentioned, conception is the result of mutual consent. That you get with the violinist, you certainly have a picture of a kind of invasion, if you will. There's kidnapping involved. There is, you're getting, someone is getting plugged into you to sustain that person's life. Again, the picture of the unborn is far different. There is no, invasion of the womb. Again, in the vast majority of cases, we have two freely consenting adults engaging in sexual activity, and the union that the sperm and egg, the sexual union that produces this, the natural habitat, if you will, the natural place for this child to be, is within the womb. It's not as though this is some alien place that you're somehow put in these odd, foreign circumstances. No, this is something that is, that is quite natural and appropriate. And what we're talking about with the violinist is something that is a far cry from that circumstance. Again, the language of kidnapping. It's kind of there's an emotionally loaded language. And also, there's kind of a question-begging language here. Why use this language of kidnapping? Why not just use a more natural language of, mother, an unborn child? Why are we talking about being kidnapped against your will and so forth? It suggests to the reader that maybe this child in your womb, you had no will in this matter. There was no consent involved in this action. There it is, thrust upon you. You had nothing to do with this whatsoever. The language that Judith Jarvis Thompson is using is emotively loaded language. And we're not talking about a stranger to stranger scenario here. We're talking about a mother and a child. I mean, how much more natural, how much more fitting is the language here than in Thompson's case that she is presenting. And so there is a greater responsibility, far greater, to care, indeed a duty, to care for and protect one's own child, whether born or unborn. Then we have another consideration, another distinction to be made here. What would be happening with the stranger who is plugged into you? This would be considered a heroic act, what is called a deed of supererogation. Now, this doesn't mean some sort of a fancy watering system. That's not what we mean by supererogation here. We mean, of course, a deed of supererogation is one that goes beyond the call of duty. It is a heroic act. It is a good act. But just because something is good doesn't mean that it is morally obligatory. A person might give a kidney, might donate a kidney to a complete stranger. We'd say, wow, that is really wonderful. That is very good of that person to do that. But that is not a duty. It's not as though we have duties to give our kidneys to strangers. That is an act of heroism. That goes beyond the call of duty, even if we can call it, truly good. But there is a duty to care for one's own child. That is not a deed of supererogation. That is a duty incumbent upon the mother. So we can make some sort of an ethical distinction here between the duties and deeds of supererogation, the latter of which is not, a duty, but it is an act of heroism. Also, another point to consider is this, that abortion is not merely withholding medical care from someone. Here we would be withholding or withdrawing from, presumably this violinist. But again, this is different from an abortion, which is actually in the intentional destruction of an unborn life, sometimes involving the crushing of a skull or dismemberment. And so, as someone has put it, for Thompson to speak of withholding care to this violinist or abortion, withholding care from the unborn, is really tantamount to smothering someone with a pillow and saying, "I'm withholding oxygen from that person." So, again, there are a number of moral distinctions that can be made here, that the parallel that Judith Jarvis Thompson has been attempting to draw really does not fit when it comes to the case of abortion. So that's just kind of an opening point for our consideration, an opening scenario for our consideration. And now what I'd like to do is just talk about briefly how the Christian faith informs the whole discussion of abortion, of taking a pro-life position. So let's unpack this a little bit. Of course, the famous passage in Psalm 139 reminds us of the remarkable wonder, the remarkable value of the unborn. You created me, my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. Notice the continuity, the personal continuity here that the psalmist is assuming. That the psalmist is saying that I, who am writing this psalm, am identical to that self, however unformed, however unaware, that there is an identity between that psalmist and what the Lord knit together in the mother's womb in those very early stages. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Interestingly here, you have the psalmist talking about, even though it is through a series of processes that the Lord put in place, it is still reflective of design. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. This is not just the result of chance happenings. No, this is the Lord's direction, even through using processes over time in a secondary or indirect sort of way. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Now, I know this is poetry, but it certainly speaks of the remarkable wonder of the Lord's creation within the womb. That there is this remarkable design, this telos that God has put into place, that even though the Lord didn't directly create or shape the psalmist in the mother's womb, the Lord put into place these wonderful patterns, these designs that have a certain goal in mind. And again, it's just a wonderful passage to contemplate. We can also, maybe you can fill me in. What other passages come to mind when we talk about the value, the dignity of life? Are there any other biblical passages that speak to this? Maybe whether it be the unborn or the newly born, the fact that life is a gift from God and so forth. Any passages that you can think of from Scripture? Think of perhaps even when Elizabeth is talking to Mary, and there is the leaping of John the Baptist in Elizabeth's womb. There's this recognition of the personhood. Even using the description of leaping for joy. Not in a technical sense, but you certainly that there is a kind of moment of celebration here, where the mother of the Lord comes to Elizabeth, and there is this kind of a picture of rejoicing here, and that there is this connection of personhood with that which is in Elizabeth's womb. We can also talk about another passage. I'll mention this right off the bat here in Genesis 1:26-28, that in God's creation, male and female are seen as having the image of God. It's not limited to a certain stage of development, but the image of God. Well, what does that involve? What does it mean to bear the image of God? Well, God has given to human beings certain capacities that enable them to carry out their role as kings and priests on the earth. That we are, that in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, man and woman, are seen as those who have fellowship with God. They walk with God. And of course, in the New Testament, we read about how we have been made through Jesus Christ a kingdom and priests to our God, that we have access to God, and that we rule with God over creation, which has a picture. It's a picture of stewardship. And so all that goes into ruling or stewarding the earth with God, all that goes into the worship of God and fellowship with God, those are the capacities that God has bestowed upon us, what we would call, again, those capacities enable us to carry out the function of the image of God. But we see here, in terms of the resources that the Christian faith, the biblical faith has to offer, we see that life is a gift. That God is the one who bestows life as a gift, that it is not a right. And again, a lot of the language of abortion and so forth, we see that life, is seen as a right, a demand. And if I don't want this life in my womb, then I have the right to dispose of that life. Life is a divinely given gift to be received rather than a right to be assumed. And we see that in the Psalms, we see in Psalm 127 that children are a heritage from the Lord, that they are a gift from the Lord. And I think that part of a large part of the problem in the whole abortion discussion is that children are no longer welcomed as a gift. They're often seen as some sort of an instrument, some sort of a commodity, something that may enhance my own self-satisfaction, my own sense of worth. But again, it is not as though life is truly a gift. And this is part of the problem when it comes to many people just sealing off children from their very lives. There's something sinister about that. If we cut off children from our lives. Why? Because we have refused to welcome them as a gift from the Lord. As and I think there is, when it comes to the the whole issue of cordoning children off from our lives, what ends up happening is we end up cutting ourselves off from great joy in having family and having children within our lives. Indeed, it is children are have a very key role in the shaping of adults. That it's more often that children shape their parents than that their parents shape their children, and that there is something to that. Janelle?
Yeah, when you were asking for scripture passages, I didn't think of anything that directly related, but with that, I thought of just how the women in biblical times would mourn over being barren and how that was so humiliating in those times to not be able to give birth. And we do mourn, but I feel like that's not as common in postmodern times as it was back in the biblical times. We don't have that value.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting to point out in biblical times there was that sense of shame, that sense of maybe humiliation, of ostracism, of not having, of not fitting in because you don't have children. And of course, there can be something, there's something problematic as though unless you have children, you cannot. You can't live with dignity or anything like that. There can be extremes here too, but it does illustrate the point that children are a blessing, and they certainly, we certainly see in the ancient Near East and in Israel how children were certainly welcomed. That this was they were seen as a gift from the Lord, and of course we don't want to create this sense of humiliation or shame for those who don't have children, as was common. But it does, as you said, illustrate the point that children, are to be received as gifts from the Lord. We've already touched on this fact that children are not to be a commodity or an instrument, and a lot of times, even as people are engaging in vitro fertilization and so forth, as Justin was just talking about in his earlier session today, that there is this often an instrumental use of children, that there is maybe even this presumed right. I have a right to have children however I can get them, and so it can be artificial insemination of from a complete stranger. It can be through there could be a surrogate mother or something like that, and again it removes the child from this context of a mother and a father, and and what is of course the gift from God that is being given there. But again, children are more often seen as a commodity or an instrument in these sorts of settings. Life is also a charge, that there is a trust to keep, and the fact that life is a gift from God reminds us that we are not sovereign over our own lives. We are not the ones who are in control of our own lives. And of course, abortion is the ultimate assertion of authority over life, bypassing divine authority over life. And so we are not sovereign over our own lives or the lives of the others that God has entrusted to our care. So that's one consideration, the whole issue of life as a gift versus life and life as a right. Another issue in the whole abortion pro-life debate has to do with choice versus life. Now, so many times you'll hear these slogans where a woman says, "I have the right to choose." I remember in a debate between Al Gore and Dan Quayle, a vice presidential debate a number of years ago. I remember, Al Gore, who is of course, he had actually shifted from a pro-life position to a pro-abortion position, but he was challenging Dan Quayle, the Republican vice presidential candidate. He's saying, "Just repeat after me. A woman has a right to choose." And, this mantra that he was trying to get Dan Quayle to repeat, leaves itself begging a number of questions. Well, for one thing, a right to choose what? You see, when we're talking about choice, we can't understand the goodness of a choice unless we actually have an object of the choice in mind. So choice is really a relative term. What am I choosing to do? It's sort of like saying to the left of. Okay, to the left of what? Turn around. I shifted my position. What was once the left is now my right, and so forth. So again, choosing is, as I say here, is not inherently self-justifying. People can choose to rape. People can choose to murder. Do we say, therefore, that's good? Repeat after me. I have the right, or a woman has a right to murder, to steal, whatever. No. What is the choice that we're actually talking about? And then we can make sense of the morality of it. Also, choice suggests a kind of individualistic perspective. A personal choice without regard for community is, of course, destructive to society. And if I'm pitting choice against the life, one of the least of these human beings, then, again, isn't it ironic that the place that is supposed to be safest for a child is often the most dangerous, the mother's womb? That the place where the child should be welcomed is often, that child is often shunned, that life is often terminated. But again, it has to, when we're talking about a community, when we're talking about welcoming children into a family, when we see things from a broader perspective than just the individual choice, the individual, herself, we start to see things in a more broadly humanizing perspective. We often find ourselves in conditions that we don't choose, but these still call for commitment. We think of this in the body of Christ. Think of how, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian, said in his book Life Together that we find ourselves bound to people, brothers and sisters in Christ, whom we had no choice in, being in our family. We just find ourselves in the same family with them. And so what does that call? What is the calling upon us in light of that circumstance? It means to love. It means to embrace. And Bonhoeffer said even coming to appreciate some of their eccentricities, some of their oddities, and even coming to, not just to put up with them, but even to love them in their eccentricities, in their oddness, and so forth. But again, we don't choose our spiritual family. We don't choose our earthly family. In large part, of course, there is adoption and so forth, and we certainly know about that in our family. But we are still nevertheless called to a committed love, to seek the well-being of others, even when it is inconvenient, even when it is challenging. That is what love calls us to do. We are called to community. We are called to love. And this means that we bypass our individualistic mindset, that Jesus himself said, the one who wants to wants to find his life will lose it, but the one who loses it for my sake will find it. So often, in general, we find life when we open it up to others, when we engage in commitment, when we learn to love others. Here's another consideration when it comes to the whole abortion issue. A lot of times, and you may have heard of, how many of you have heard of Peter Singer? He's a noted, I hate to use this term, but he's an ethicist at Princeton University. But, yes, an unscrupulous ethicist. Sort of like, an atheist theologian. You have those around too. But Peter Singer talks about personhood as being determined by functions. That we have certain functions, and if we live up to that if we had these functions intact, then we meet a certain minimum criterion for, in his eyes, being able to survive. It seems that Peter Singer picks on those people who can't fight back. That if and he distinguishes between human non-persons and also, he talks about personal non-humans, that there are certain animals that reach a higher level of function, chimpanzees, orangutans, pigs even, that have a higher level of function than, say, a child with spina bifida or Down syndrome and so forth. And so therefore, even though we can call them humans, they are non-persons in Peter Singer's mind because they don't meet this criterion of, or these criteria of functionality. So, there is a certain level of social awareness, of self-awareness, of rationality. Do they actually meet these criteria? And if they don't, well, then they could legitimately, morally, justifiably be disposed of. Life could be taken. So you have a patient who has Alzheimer's. Somebody like, who does not have the mental capacity, the mental wherewithal for self-deliberation and so forth. Well, Peter Singer would say it would be morally justifiable to take that human being's life that is no longer functioning as a person. Kind of interesting that Peter Singer has held this view, but when his own mother, Cora Singer, had Alzheimer's, he didn't want to act so rashly or consistently with his own mother as he did with everyone else's mother. He actually had a group of people caring for her. And when he was asked, well, why are you keeping your mother alive when she is actually not a person after all? He said, well, actually, her being cared for is giving a lot of people jobs. A lot of the medical team here, they have jobs, and so it's helping to sustain them. So he was justifying it on what he's a utilitarian, on the consequences that come through this. So when it comes to other people's mothers, sure, it's okay, but not when it comes to Cora Singer, his own mother. Very interesting. There is, however, something about an essentialist understanding that human beings have certain capacities, that we are, Jesus Christ himself became human. He shared with us in our humanity. That there is this commonality this commonality that we share, but it is not according to function. Because if we just operate according to function, think about this: what if you were in a coma? What if you were temporarily incapacitated? Would you no longer be a person? What if those capacities that you have would, say, in a couple of months, be restored? You see, what is more fundamental is not function, but rather essence, or that there is an integrity to who we are at our core. That there are certain capacities that we have within our souls to maybe learn language, to be rational and so forth, that these can be restored once those physical blockages have been removed. But what is at the core is not a certain list of functions, but rather a certain essence, a certain nature that we have. So that is the more basic feature. So if we're sleeping even, we're not operating at that functional level that Peter Singer demands of what counts for a person. So if we're sleeping, are we no longer persons? Well, of course not. But so that functionalism, that criterion simply does not work. Let's talk about a couple of other items here. Abortion versus infanticide. Now, this is written by, this book, what I believe, written by Anthony Kenny, who's an agnostic philosopher, actually had trained to be a priest and left the priesthood, but you can see the influence of his, I think, moral and theological training has stayed with him. And he says that if any argument that is used to justify abortion, in vitro fertilization, stem cell research, he says must undergo the following test. Very interesting point of consistency here. Said, would the same argument justify infanticide? If so, then it must be rejected. I mean, what's the difference? A lot of people will make this huge moral difference or metaphysical difference between a child inside the womb and a child outside the womb. I mean, what's the difference? You know, just a few inches in the birth canal and all of a sudden it's a different entity? No, or what about a cesarean section? It doesn't even actually go through the birth canal. And what about premature? Preemies. What about their status? And so we can raise all sorts of questions. And again, as I said at the beginning, once you start to see the arguments for abortion, just apply them to infanticide, apply them to euthanasia. You'll find that a lot of them, if they were applied across the board, I mean, they just totally self-destruct. But yet there is something seemingly so, something about that mother's womb, that location, that somehow justifies all manner of harm to the youngest, to the smallest in our human community. Other life-related issues, and again, we'll pause in a few minutes for some questions, and I could add a little more. But other considerations that we can bring to the table, as I said, there's that interrelation of arguments concerning abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, and we have to ask questions. Well, what about that function, for example, of having a right to choose, the freedom to choose, that category of personhood that Peter Singer so applauds? Well, what if you've got, say, a 21-year-old, he's legal, but doesn't feel any purpose to life. He's healthy in his body at least, but doesn't feel that there's any point to living. Should we maybe even encourage him to carry out the desires of his heart by committing suicide, helping him to do this, because after all, he's asserting his own autonomy. He's asserting his own will here. So again, there are a cluster of issues related to that. One point that we ought to keep in mind, too, is that we can sometimes overreach on the question of the sanctity of life. Sometimes people assume that the sanctity of life means that we ought to avoid death at all possible costs, at all possible expense, and never come to terms with the reality of death and of, at some point, letting go. There may be a point where we say, I'm 90 years old. I'm not going to go through this heart surgery. I'm just going to put my house in order, and I will go the way of my fathers, as the scriptures say. Well, that would not be. It's not as though this is life denying somehow. It simply comes to terms with our own mortality, that at least at this stage, can put our house in order, that we can make certain decisions. Not everyone is at that point of being able to do that. Sometimes they lose their mental fiber, so to speak, and so can't carry that out. But where we can exert a certain sense of autonomy, of control over our lives, to set our house in order, to say our goodbyes and so forth, and to come to terms with the fact that death is awaiting me. And so what am I going to do in light of that? I mean, it's problematic if I'm actually not told as a patient that I am dying, that there's something problematic if I can't begin to get my mind prepared for death, to set my house in order and so forth. And so we have to be careful about absolutizing life so that we don't actually come to terms with the reality of death and being willing to let go and rather than trying to clutch life. There are lots of things that are actually worse than death, and so we need to keep that in mind as well. Anyway, I can go into more details here about withholding, versus withdrawing treatment, and I'd say they're morally equivalent. But anyway, and nutrition and hydration versus medical care, that we are obligated to feed those who can receive food. But medical treatment is different. That there may not be an obligation to give medical care to, say, someone who is dying and who will not benefit from medical care. But we should try to sustain as best we can through nutrition and hydration. Though at the end of life things can get complicated and you can have aspiration problems and so forth. Anyway, let me just make a few final comments here. When it comes to the Christian faith, we actually have remarkable resources for protecting the unborn life. You see, the Christian faith overall gives us resources for affirming personhood. What makes better sense, that we have come from a background of impersonal material forces, or that we have been created by a personal being? Personhood brings forth personhood rather than these impersonal processes somehow producing personhood. Or rationality. Why think that human beings should, why think that rationality should emerge at all if we're simply the products of these blind, non-rational forces that are from the Big Bang until today? Or what about value? We talk about valuing things, about certain things having value or dignity, and we talk about human rights all the time. Well, why think that such a thing as human rights should ever be part of our vocabulary, part of our thinking, if we are simply the products of these valueless forces from the Big Bang until today? What about freedom, free will to act? If we are simply the products of these blind deterministic processes, why think that freedom, free will should emerge if we're simply the product of these deterministic forces? What about self-awareness? Why think that self-awareness, consciousness, or self-consciousness should exist if we're the products of these non-conscious materialistic processes? The Christian faith actually gives us a whole host of resources to make sense of a lot of the things that people like Peter Singer value, rationality, personhood, freedom to make certain decisions. Well, that comes from the Christian faith. We see a lot of people borrowing from the Christian faith in order to try to inject something into their own systems. Even using something from the Christian faith to set criteria for their own naturalistic worldviews and engaging personhood. What about language and communication? The remarkable capacity that human beings have to communicate with language. In fact, that agnostic philosopher Anthony Kenny said that he has three things that three reasons he's not an atheist. Is one has to do with the origin of the universe. The universe began to exist a finite time ago. Secondly, the origin of life. He doesn't see how life could emerge from non-life unless there. He said it just. Things look a lot more like God when it comes to all of that. And then thirdly, he says the origin of language. He said if you're simply talking about a naturalistic evolutionary understanding of things, he said to account for language is just utterly mystifying. Anyway, you can take a look at his book, What I Believe, and he gets into some detail on that. And again, I'm out of time here, but even people who are atheists, skeptics, agnostics, they, leading intellectuals in the world acknowledge that the Christian faith has actually given the resources to ground a lot of the values that we have here in the West when it comes to democracy, when it comes to equal rights before the law, and so on. Jürgen Habermas, a noted leading philosopher in Europe, acknowledges the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love to make sense of these very gains. Anyway, I'm going to have to stop here. Jacques Derrida, another, who says these sorts of things as well, that the sacred in humanity is something that comes out of the biblical heritage, that there would be nothing like the crime against humanity had it not been for the biblical worldview to inform our thinking about these matters. All right, let me stop here and see if there are any questions or comments. But I hope you see the remarkable resources that the Christian faith has as we navigate through some of these waters of the abortion debate, and how really, when we go back to Thompson's analogy of the violinist, that we see that this actually, the analogy itself doesn't stand up. It doesn't make the case for abortion. It doesn't make the sense for. It doesn't make sense of taking, the life of a person, which again, as Thompson is doing as an atheist, or an agnostic, she herself is borrowing from a biblical worldview to talk about a person, presumably who has value. So anyway, those are some things to keep in mind. But that's a little bit of an overview for you all, and so we'll be happy to take whatever questions in the remaining period of time that we have. Thank you. Yes, Bob.
I believe it was Marco Rubio when he was still running for president. He took the position of being solidly pro-life and even believed that all abortion should be outlawed, including in the case of incest and rape.
Right.
Can you think of any verses, scripture verses that might have a bearing on these possible exceptions?
Well, I think the fundamental principle of all human beings being made in the image of God would be, would ground, opposition to the presumption that, if there's been rape or incest, that therefore, that life can be taken as though that life does not have value. We ought to resist that way of thinking. However, there are some challenges that come along with this. When you are dealing with politics, you may have to sometimes opt for a half a loaf rather than push for a whole loaf and get nothing at all. So there may be, it's been said, hard cases make bad laws, and we have to be careful about setting up difficult laws that may actually create a kind of backlash against the very cause for which we are striving. So I think on the one hand, you don't want to make the move that Mario Cuomo did, when he, as governor of New York, he said, that personally he's opposed to abortion, but he's not going to legislate against abortion or try to push to stop abortion at all in the public square. Well, he certainly thought differently when it came to capital punishment. He thought that this is wrong as a private citizen, but he didn't say, but who am I to resist this? No, he did resist that idea in public legislation. I think the same sort of integrity should apply to abortion, that where you are in a position of influence, you ought to affirm the value of the unborn and say, we've told in our own family, we've had children, a daughter, for example, who had a friend who was ended up having an abortion, but we said to our daughter, persuade her, say, you can live with us until you have your baby. We'll take the baby. We were certainly willing to step. We'd love to have a baby dropped at our doorstep. My wife is often saying, because we want to affirm life. So I think that a person who's in politics should not have this kind of divided viewpoint, but say, opt for adoption. That child hasn't done anything to warrant this. There's also the recognition that hard cases make bad laws. So even though, so you recognize that there is a kind of tension here. But what you ought to be doing is saying, that push for saving the child's life. And even putting forth examples of people who have been who were conceived out of rape or incest, but who are grateful that the mother didn't go through with having an abortion. I think that's the kind of message that needs to be out there. So anyway, that's how I think it probably should most wisely be approached. But again, we have to be careful about saying no. When you say no abortion. No abortion under any circumstances, that is where you'll probably get some pushback, and it may lead to, unfortunately, losing more lives than it will save because of the backlash that it will create. So those are some things to keep in mind. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about your insight, and maybe Justin's as well, because we have similar notes, about contraception. In the case, is there an equation with abortion, especially when we're talking about some oral contraceptives or IUDs that allow fertilization? And certainly one point you made, and I think you would agree, I guess an Orthodox Christian viewpoint would be that life begins at fertilization. And of course, the developing embryo, child would not be able to develop until it becomes embedded in the uterine wall. And we know a lot of oral contraceptives and other devices basically work because they do not allow the fertilized egg to embed in the mother's womb.
Right.
Would you equate that type of contraception to abortion?
Yeah.
Because it does not allow the fertilized egg to develop.
Yeah. I mean, there are some, obviously, birth control methods that are not abortifacients, but the ones that are, there's some that simply may be harmful to women. Just apart from any sort of abortifacient capacity, that women should just be very careful about ingesting those things and really messing with their bodies like that. But when it comes, I'd say definitely anything that would keep would serve as an abortifacient would be highly morally problematic. That life would not be honored, and so would strongly resist that sort of a thing.
So I guess tying into your talk as far as either folks having a cognitive dissonance or just a unawareness.
Yeah, I think unawareness is probably the bigger thing, especially among young Christian couples who get married and really don't know the kinds of effects that the medicines they're being prescribed are having on their bodies or having potentially on their children's lives. So I think there's just a general lack of medical knowledge about how these things work, so to speak.
Sure. And I think especially in churches where there isn't really a hardline stance against contraception, I just think folks are not aware that how these mechanisms work, where you truly believe that life begins when the sperm penetrates the egg and becomes fertilized. You're just not allowing that egg to you are withholding substance, you're withholding oxygen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're squashing life. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, and I do touch on some of these things, and I co-authored a book called An Introduction to Biblical Ethics, which goes into that detail and highlights that very point that you're raising, Tom. So thanks for bringing that up. Okay, it looks like a crowd is gathering outside our door, but thanks so much for coming. It's been great to be with you all. Thanks for listening.